Figure 343 seen here is one of almost 500 illustrations published in the 1949 edition of an Introduction to Clinical Surgery written by Charles Frederick Morris Saint. It is a clinical photograph, a medical image, that seeks to recreate the face-to-face experience of encountering and observing a patient in life. Published within this medical text written by Saint, South Africa's so-called father of surgery, this image is meant to operate as an objective demonstration of a particular clinical sign, the swelling of the neck as caused by an external carotid aneurysm, a bulge in the wall of one of two arterial vessels that transport blood to the brain. The positioning of this image within this publication creates the conditions for viewers to read the person depicted as a clinical case, a human body that bears conspicuous symptoms to be deciphered. The achievement is, however, neither neutral nor natural, but the product of both visual and discursive frames created by interrelated motives and actions. The context of this publication and its author are worth noting. Before the emergence of clinical education in South Africa, medical training was sought overseas, most notably in Edinburgh. Unlike other British colonies, including Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, there was a hesitancy to embrace local clinical training due to not only the fear of substandard education, but the supposedly inferior, quote, clinical teaching material, in other words, human bodies, available at this locale. Saint began his career in Cape Town in 1920 as the first surgical chair of the country's first medical school. Born, raised, and trained in Britain, then 34-year-old Saint brought a British medical pedigree and thus scientific respectability to the new curriculum. When this book was published almost 30 years later, it was a product of Saint's experience gleaned within the South African context. Yet, unlike colonial medical texts that focus on the blackness of their subject, this publication was by no means restricted to a single geographical terrain or racialized body. Added to medical libraries and reviewed by medical journals in Britain as well as North America, the local context and contents were notably elided, while the book's usefulness for all surgical students was repeatedly touted. In this way, Saint's publication can be seen to perpetuate a universalist understanding of biomedical knowledge, that no matter the source, clinical evidence is clinical evidence. The representational techniques in Figure 343 demonstrate a similar leaning towards this sense of universalism. By posing the patient in profile and removing the background, standard depictive practices outlined first in Albert Lon's 1893 publication Photographic Médicale, as well as seminal 20th century texts by Thomas Longmore, Josephine Hunt, and Henry Louis Gibson, are used to make it appear objective, neutral, and ultimately scientific. Like the clinical training Cape Town's medical school espoused, Figure 343 is framed as universally useful. Visually, it compares to clinical photographs produced in the Western world, while the patient's race is never mentioned. In scanning a series of loose photographs in one of the medical school's archives, I stumbled upon this patient's likeness once more. The square, published image is no bigger than a postage stamp, printed on light semi-gloss photographic paper. It is affixed with adhesive tape, yellowed and brittle with age, to a roughly cut rectangle of thin beige card bearing yet another photograph. As a whole, this object fits easily in one's hand, and its material makeup, the weight, thickness, color, and texture of the mounting board in particular, suggests that it dates to the 1920s. Tilting the photograph reveals that the print itself bears evidence of alterations. Thin black marks are drawn on the emulsion surface, creating a defined outline around the patient's hair, facial features, and even her clothing, but not the symptomatic site. These marks reveal aesthetic attention, a concern for the appearance of the patient's likeness, and a consideration for the quality of the image beyond its objective rendering of pathology. However, it is in lifting the unknown photograph that further activities of historical actors are revealed. Pencil lines etched across the surface of both card and photograph further testify to the hand of the photographic technician who sought to delimit the image produced for publication. Yet beyond this frame, the patient can be seen sitting on the ground, barefoot and bent-legged, hands in her lap, blanket over her knees. Typical of local clinical photographs of this period, the image is taken outside with the high location of the sun creating stark shadows under her eyes, nose, lips, and neck. Hovering above and behind the patient, a second female figure stands, holding the edges of a white apron with both hands, eclipsing what lies beyond the sitter's head. While the surroundings suggest a semi-rural habitat, not the manicured gardens nor built environment of Cape Town, or the urban spaces of the medical school and its hospitals, this contextual detail is intentionally obscured. Once cropped, it and the standing figure vanish. As a young, ambitious surgical chair, Saint forged his career in South Africa in a typically colonial fashion. He made a name for himself both locally and abroad, demonstrating that clinical education in Cape Town was equal to that of the metropole. Achieving this, however, required a particular framing of both the medical knowledge generated and the local, quote, teaching material, harnessed within this context. Like the depictive acts that give clinical photographs their aura of objectivity, Figure 343 elides its geographic location as well as its racialized context, rendering it fit for both local publication and international consumption. Thus, while the shade of the patient's skin might be evident in the image, it is treated as a clinically irrelevant attribute, a factor that, like the background, lies outside of medical interest. The original photographic print from which Figure 343 was extracted reveals the unseen activities and aesthetic constructions that make it function as reputable medical evidence within Saint's book. The posing of the patient, the staging of the standing figure, the cropping of the print, the annotation of the image, and the published description of the case all aim to render the noted pathology decipherable on the human body and universal in decontextualized time and space. Ultimately, it is through the active work of photographer and technician, author and publisher, as well as patient and bystander, that the original scene is thus made into a medical image. Thank you.